and saved enough money to enroll at Boston University in September of 1942. And just as my first semester was coming to an end, I received a summons from the draft board in New Britain for induction into the Armed Forces of the United States of America. On February 26, 1943, I left New Britain for Camp Devens in Massachusetts. We arrived at Devens around 5 p.m. There we were issued our military garb, and the next day we journeyed to Atlantic City in New Jersey, where we were billeted in the newly built Claridge Hotel. Our 1-month basic training program there consisted of marching up and down Atlantic City's famed boardwalk, lying on the beach, and firing our rifles at imaginary targets out into the Atlantic Ocean.
Haige, were you assigned a branch of service at that point?
And not at that point, no. From Atlantic City, we journeyed to Norwich University in Northfield, Vermont, arriving there on March 31, 1943, for an intensive college training detachment program. Academic studies at Norwich embraced a variety of subjects, including mathematics, geography, history, meteorology, fundamentals of flight. Close order drilling, early morning calisthenics, cross-country running up and down the foothills of the Great Mountains helped to keep our bodies in shape. Our stay at Norwich was capped off with flight training, which was carried out by East Coast Airways based at Barry Montpelier Airport, where I received 9 hours of flight instruction on a 65 horsepower Piper Cub. Here's how a typical flight played out. Flight number 11. After Mr. Keese got back with his student, I got into the plane. One of the line boys spun the prop, and Mr. Keese started the plane towards the runway. From here, I took off and taxied the plane. I took over and taxied the plane in preparation for our takeoff. When we were sure there was no incoming or outgoing traffic, we took off. I flew the traffic pattern and left it at 40-degree angle when we had reached a height of 800 feet. Today, we did all of our stalls with power on and power off. Next, we did spins. Mr. Keith first demonstrated a spin, and then I did one. I put the plane into a stall, and as she started to brake, I gave it full right rudder, and after 2 complete turns, I neutralized the rudder and gave slight but sharp forward stick and assumed normal level flight. We then did a few climbing turns to 1,500 feet and headed back to the airport, where I entered the traffic pattern and landed the plane. After we landed, we taxied the plane to the gas pit, where it was refueled. We then pushed the plane to the line and tied it down. One moment while I collect my thoughts.
That's fine. Now I would assume you were not in the Army. You were obviously in a branch of service already at this point. So you were assigned to the Air Force?
Air Force, yeah.
Was it the Army Air Corps then?
It
or
was the Army Air Corps then.
Army Air Corps.
Yeah, right. Completing the program at Norwich University, we proceeded to the Air Crew Classification Center in Nashville, Tennessee, where I opted to go into the pilot training program. I took my Air Force cadet training at Maxwell Field in Montgomery, Alabama. It got underway in October 1, 1943 and lasted till December 9, 1943, after which I reported to Embry-Riddle Field in Union City, Tennessee for primary flight training. My primary flight training book shows that I received a total of 65 hours of flight training, that I soloed after 11 hours of training, and that on January 28, 1944, I made a 3-hour and 10-minute solo cross-country flight from Union City to Greenfield to Dyersburg, Tennessee, and back to Embry-Riddle Field, aboard my airplane, a 220 horsepower PT-23 Continental. My logbook also records 7 hours of link instrument flight training. After completing this phase of flight training, I proceeded to Newport, Arkansas, and pursued further flight training, this time on a 450 horsepower BT-13. One moment. My pilot flight record book shows that from February 17 through March 21, 1944, I logged 14 hours and 25 minutes of dual time and 7 hours and 45 minutes of solo time. I soloed after 6 hours and 25 minutes. Alas, my training was terminated as of March 22. The reason given was for, quote, lack of coordination.
Did you feel that was accurate?
Well, I had heard rumblings that the Air Force had enough cadets in training that they just weren't going to go on any further from that, and so I sensed that that was the reason for it. After all, I had coordination to go through primary and halfway through basic, and at that point, it just didn't feel right. But anyway, at this juncture, I was given the option of pursuing a career as a glider pilot, a bursar, a radio operator. But because I had learned Morse code while in pilot training, I chose radio operator training. From April 15 to October 31, 1944, I honed my radio operator skills at Scott Field in Illinois. Following a 2-week furlough, I journeyed to Lincoln, Nebraska for assignment to a B-29 flight crew. From Lincoln, our crew took up quarters at a base in Fairmont, Nebraska, where we awaited our airplane commander, Captain Alphonse Marish, who had recently completed 30 missions flying B-17s out of Great Britain. He was one of the first pilots to jump into the B-29 program when it opened up. Now, cold weather in Nebraska was the excuse for us to fly off to Puerto Rico in January of 1945, where we flew practice missions out of Borinquen Field. We returned to Fairmont for the remainder of our training before proceeding to our base on Guam. En route to Guam, we were put up at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel in Hawaii, presently and still being called the Pink Hotel. We waited there for several weeks before our runways on Guam were still being readied by the Seabees. We arrived finally on the island of Guam in May of 1945. The island was to be our home for the next 5 months. We flew a total of 14 missions over the main islands of Japan: Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, Shikoku. Initial bombings were from a height of 29,000 feet. Later bombings were from much lower altitudes due to the deterioration of the Japanese Air Force. They would come up, get our altitude, and then the anti-aircraft guns would fire up at us. A few flights we heard the rattling underneath our plane. Now, our flights lasted anywhere from 14 to 16 hours. On the way back from one of our longest flights, we had to make a refueling stop on Mount Iwo Jima. Being stripped of all armaments, except for a gun turret in the tail, our planes were able to fly heavier bomb loads to our targets. For the most part, our loads consisted of incendiary bombs. Because Captain Marish was such a highly regarded and experienced pilot, our crew was selected to fly films of the Japanese surrender aboard the battleship Missouri and back to Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. We lounged around Andrews for several weeks. Finally, the order came through that we wouldn't have to return to Guam, even though we were short of the 90 points required for separation from the service at that time. I was honorably discharged on November 19, 1945, and soon after, thanks to the GI Bill of Education, I re-enrolled and completed my studies at Boston University. Within the bounds of security, I kept my family members apprised of what was going on throughout my service experience. There are 2 boxes filled with letters that I sent and received during the 34 months of my military service. As an aside, I would like to mention that on November 7, 1989, 4 elementary grade students from the Elmwood School in Hopkinton, Massachusetts, sent letters to me in conjunction with a classroom assignment where they asked such questions as, did you worry about getting killed at night and not waking up in the morning? Did you get hurt? Where did you sleep? Did you ever think of home, and how did you feel? Were you ever wounded? Did you kill anyone? What was your code name? In addition to reciting brief highlights of my service experience, my 6-page response to the students included the following message. As I look back and reflect upon my war experience, my only sense of satisfaction lies in the fact that we, along with our allies, fought against common enemies who were bent on destroying our way of life, which is based upon individual rights and freedoms. The fact that we won the war is certainly a credit to the millions of brave American, British, and Russian soldiers who made the supreme sacrifice in defense of the things they believed in. Subsequent wars that have been fought in Korea, Vietnam, and those that are still being waged in the Middle East make it abundantly clear that wars do not solve problems. They only bring about much suffering, destruction of lives and property, and use up valuable resources that can be put to better use in improving the lives of human beings. Thank goodness, world leaders in the Soviet Union, the United States, and in Europe are finally coming to around to the realization that it is far better to sit down and resolve differences in a peaceful manner instead of resorting to war. If I have any words of wisdom to pass on to you, let them be that you study hard to become better citizens of the world, that you have compassion and share your good fortune with boys and girls who may not be as well off as you, that you be skeptical of movies and television shows that glorify war activities and senseless destruction of lives and property, that you strive to settle your arguments and differences with friends as well as with enemies in a rational manner. Thank you for writing to me. I do hope some good will come of this classroom exercise. I would like to add that on December 21, 1947, in my senior year at Boston University, I married a Watertown, Massachusetts girl named Garabedian. We lived our lives together for nearly 63 years before she passed away on October 18, 2010. We raised 3 children, Thomas, Andrea, and Audrey, in whom we are most proud. Our grandchildren, number 6, Didon, a Dartmouth grad, is living and working in London. Berge, who is doing his graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. Gregory, a Providence College grad who is currently working and living in Brazil. Alyssa, a graduate of Franklin and Marshall College, is actively pursuing a career in creative writing. Justine, a graduate of Merrimack College and Boston University's medical school program, is currently enrolled in BU's dental school program. And finally, Jared, who is in his senior year at UConn, the University of Connecticut. As for me, I retired in January 1985 after serving 37 years as general manager of Printing Industry Association of Connecticut and Western Massachusetts. All I can say is I've lived a wonderful and productive life.
Thanks, Haige. To add a little bit more, obviously you had a successful life after serving the country in World War II. Do you think World War II played any part in your preparation for your future after that, or a role in how successful you might have been, or your views about the world after?
Well, I think my training at Norwich University helped. The program was geared for cadet training purposes. And of course, many of the participants were not college trained. So that's the reason why there were courses in mathematics and history and meteorology and subjects of that nature to bring them up to speed.
Was that typically just for individuals headed to flight training?
Yes.
That were going there?
Yes.
So they sent you to a university to get additional training before going to flight training?
Right.
But you were already in the military at that point?
I was, yeah.
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 That's interesting.
One year, my wife and I had traveled to Detroit, Michigan, and on the way back through Canada, we scooted on down to visit Norwich University to see what a changed campus it was. Many more buildings, more students, and I hope they're all having as an enjoyable time as I had while I was there for the 5-month period.
Sure. When you went on to the other locations you were talking about, you got to, I believe it was Nebraska at some point where it was...
I was in Fairmont, Nebraska, and as you know, Nebraska is cold in the wintertime, and we would have to scrape our wings in preparation for flights. And that's the reason why we went to Puerto Rico. But while I was in Fairmont, around Christmas time, one of the captains wanted to visit his family in Texas. So I was in my barracks. Someone came up and said, "Come with me." And on the way, he told me that they needed a radio operator to go on this B-17 flight down to Texas, which required an airplane commander, co-pilot, and a radio operator in order to get weather reports and so forth. B-17s was not a pleasurable plane as far as I was concerned. B-29s are pressurized, they're heated, very comfortable, and that's not the case with B-17s. I don't know how those boys withstood flying in Europe. The gun turrets, there were open spaces around the gun turrets. And no matter how many coats of protective wear they wore, they were always cold. And that's exactly the experience I went through, flying with the captain down to Love Field in Texas. I froze all the way down. And every time he asked for a weather report, I was shivering away while I got the report for him. It was a completely different experience than flying in a B-29. Yeah.
Was a B-29 a fairly new aircraft at that point for the military?
It was.
And can you describe it to the extent you know the aircraft?
Well, the B-29 had a cruising speed of 220 miles an hour, and top rated speed was about 315 miles per hour. But on our flights from Guam to Japan, we were mostly on cruising speed and carrying a heavy bomb load.
Was the range significant on those? I mean, how far could you fly?
Well, as I mentioned, some of our flights lasted 14, 15 hours.
With no refueling?
With no refueling.
Really?
Yeah.
So you didn't have fighter escorts for the obvious reason they probably couldn't follow you that far, or?
We had no flight arrest, no escorts along with our flights.
Was there a reason to have an escort at that point, or was the
There
war-
wasn't any reason because I guess they surmised that the Air Force, the Japanese Air Force was insignificant and there was no need for us. And I think they were maybe under the misapprehension that the B-29s carried a lot of armament, and which is one reason why they just steered clear of us. You know.
Could you see the results of your bombing raids, or were you too high at that point?
Since all of our flying was at night, all we could see was were dropping incendiary bombs that were starting fires on the ground. But aside from that, no visual of what was happening on the ground. We knew there were a lot of fires taking place. You know.
Did you have feelings about that, or in subsequent years later, having been part of bombing missions?
You know, when you're in your early 20s, you weren't thinking about those things. You know, when you later in life, you realize what impact your actions are having on other people.
Do you recall at all the end of the war, where you were, and
At the end of the war,
when it was announced?
we stayed at Andrews Field, just outside of Washington, D.C. And in essence, what we did was kill time.
Do you remember the day it was announced, though, when the war was over? Were you still in the Pacific at that time?
We were still in the Pacific at that time.
Does that bring up a memory, a particular memory of where you were, or not?
No.
Did you expect
Whether
it?
I was in the Quonset hut or taking a shower,
Yeah.
you know, one of the saving graces of being in the Air Corps was, unlike soldiers, ground soldiers, foot soldiers who slogged through mud and snow and ice and no heat and no food, we had a soft life. We had a place to sleep every night. We took showers whenever we wanted. The food was not only adequate, but savory, so
Life was good.
life was good.
Yeah.
Life was good.
Do you recall, I don't recall when you began the interview, if you indicated, did you enlist at the time? And was it a matter of war?
I was drafted.
You were drafted.
I was drafted.
And was that a surprise to you, or you expected it?
No, being in college, we were hearing talk of people going into the service and being drafted. I did not make the election to go into the service. I was drafted into the service.
Did you have an election as far as what your profession might have been in the service once you entered, or was that something they just assigned you to
that
play?
came later on when we went to a classification center. And so they put you in categories.
Through testing, I would assume.
You know,
Yep. And how did you feel about potentially being a pilot, since you hadn't planned on going in the
well, I
service
thought
to
it would
begin
be a
with?
glorious affair. You know, it sounded very challenging.
Yeah.
And being a young person, you know, the Blue Yonder was appealing.
Yeah. Do you remember the feelings the first time you were in the air, in an aircraft? Was that the first time you had ever flown?
The Piper Cup training at Norwich University was the first time I was ever in a plane. And when I say plane, you know, I put the Piper Cup at the low end of the scale.
But still in the air.
The wind shifts you around, you're up and down, and the stability is not there that you found later on in your future training programs aboard much heavier planes. So,
What was your rank at that point when they sent you at that point in your career? Are you a cadet, or
I was a cadet.
You're called a cadet at that
Yeah.
point.
I was a cadet.
And then when you left there and went on to wherever the next station was, when you weren't going to be a pilot, what was your rank at that point?
Well, when I recall, I was a corporal at Scottfield, Illinois, and of course, when I left the service, I had the rank of staff sergeant.
Good.
You know,
Is there-
which the flight engineer on our B-29 also was a staff sergeant. the other crew members below the officers were all corporals.
Can you describe a little bit of what a radio operator did on the aircraft, what your responsibilities were during a bombing run on?
Well, in the bombing runs, you were monitoring mostly, listening for signals of other people in distress, or you were constantly getting weather reports to convey to the pilot. And there was a lot of sleep time when you weren't doing anything.
For the 14 hours on?
Yeah, but you had to keep the earphones on and continue to monitor.
Did you have more than one radio you monitored?
No.
Just one radio?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to add to the interview at this time?
Well, I've sort of given you a chronological order of my service. As I mentioned earlier, we didn't endure the privations that soldiers in the other services went through, whether in the Navy or foot soldiers in the Army. We just didn't incur any of the privations that they did.
Nothing else to add beyond that?
No,
In that,
unless you have any specific questions that I failed to answer.
Not really. It was
Yeah.
excellent. On a private note, I'd like to thank you for your service to our country. And
Well, I appreciate the time and effort you put into the program as well.
my
It's
pleasure.
not everyone that would volunteer that kind of service.
Well, there's enough of us, I think. But thank you for your service, more importantly.
Very much.